Somewhere under the cold water of Lake Superior, and scattered through the pine country above it, there are holes in the ground that nobody has ever fully explained. Thousands of them, pits cut into solid bedrock, some of them older than the pyramids at Giza, and out of those pits came a metal so pure you could pick it up off the ground and hammer it into a blade without ever lighting a fire. No smelting, no furnace, just cold, clean copper sitting in the rock like it was left there on purpose. For a long time, the people who dug those pits were treated as a footnote. Ancient miners, the textbook said, and then moved on. But here is the part that keeps getting skipped. Somebody mined an enormous amount of copper out of that region over thousands of years, and when archaeologists try to account for all of it, the numbers get strange. A lot of that metal is simply not where you would expect it to be, and the people who lived on that land, the Ojibwe, the Anishinaabe, never lost the memory of what the copper was, where it came from, or where it went. I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. They kept that story alive while the official record went quiet. So this is a story about copper, but it is really a story about accounting, about what happens to the ledger of history when a whole economy gets buried, and about the possibility that the people we were taught to overlook were holding the receipts the entire time. Let me take you north. The Keweenaw Peninsula hooks out into Lake Superior like a bent finger. It is one of the only places on Earth where copper occurs naturally in its pure metallic form, in quantities you can actually build a civilization around. Most copper on this planet is locked inside ore. You have to crush the rock, roast it, and chemically wrestle the metal out of it. That is a whole industrial process. It requires heat, knowledge, and infrastructure. But not here. Here, glaciers scraped the land and left behind chunks of native copper the size of a fist, sometimes the size of a car, sometimes bigger, float copper, they call the loose pieces. And in the veins that run through the basalt, there was more of it than anyone at the time could have counted. Then there is Isle Royale, a long, lonely island sitting out in the lake near the Canadian side. Today, it is a national park, mostly known for wolves and moose. But walk that island with the right eyes and you find them. Pits, trenches, ancient workings dug down into the rock, following the copper veins with a patience that is hard to describe. Whoever did this did not do it casually. They came back, season after season, generation after generation, for a very long time. And that is the first thing that stops you: the age. The mining tradition in this region is old. Not old like a few centuries. Old like the last ice age is still a recent memory. Some estimates for the earliest copper working around the Great Lakes push back thousands of years into a period archaeologists call the Old Copper Complex. We are talking about a metalworking tradition that may predate the bronze industries of the Mediterranean. Sit with that for a second. While people in the ancient Near East were still figuring out how to combine tin and copper into bronze, there were communities in North America already pulling pure copper out of the ground and shaping it into knives, spear points, awls, fish hooks, and beads. The tools they left behind are beautiful, thin, worked, deliberate. This was not stumbling. This was craft, handed down. And the way they got the copper out of the rock tells you just how serious the operation was. They did not have iron picks or steel drills or explosives. What they had was fire, water, and stone, and a technique that took real patience. They would build fires against the copper-bearing rock to heat it, then throw cold water on it to crack it, working the metal loose a little at a time. And they pounded. All through those old pits, in numbers that are genuinely hard to picture, people have found the stone hammers. Rounded cobbles, many of them grooved so a handle could be lashed around them, worn down from endless striking against the rock. Not dozens of them. Not hundreds. In some of the old workings they turned up by the thousands, sometimes piled where they were dropped, as if a shift had ended and the crew had simply walked away, planning to come back. That is not the residue of a few curious people chipping at a rock. That is the residue of an industry, run for a very long time, by people who knew exactly what they were doing. Now, here is where the mystery starts to breathe. If you try to estimate how much copper was removed from these ancient pits over the entire span of the mining tradition, you run into a wall of uncertainty, because a lot of the workings were later destroyed or reopened by modern industrial mining in the 1800s. But even the conservative pictures describe a staggering amount of labour, thousands of pits, millions of hours of work. And some researchers, looking at the sheer volume of rock that was moved, have argued that the amount of copper taken out over the millennia was far larger than the amount that shows up in the archaeological record as finished artifacts. That is the gap. That is the thing that will not sit still. We can find copper tools spread across an astonishing distance. Copper from the Great Lakes turns up in burial mounds hundreds and hundreds of miles away, carried down river systems, traded hand to hand across half a continent. The trade network was real, and it was vast, and it lasted for thousands of years. Mainstream archaeology tells us the copper flowed into these enormous indigenous trade routes, the same routes that later fed the great mound-building cultures of the Ohio and Mississippi valleys. And that is true. That happened. It is one of the most impressive economic stories in the ancient world, and it almost never gets taught with the weight it deserves. Look at what the Hopewell peoples were doing across the Ohio Valley 2,000 years ago. They built earthworks so large and so geometrically precise that we are still mapping and studying them today, enormous rings and squares and octagons laid out across the landscape. And into their world came goods from all over the continent, obsidian carried from the Rocky Mountains, shells from the Gulf of Mexico, mica from the southern Appalachians, shark's teeth from the ocean, and copper from the Great Lakes, hammered into elaborate ceremonial pieces, worn by people of status, buried with the honoured dead. This was not barter between neighbours. This was a continental exchange system, a web of long-distance relationships moving valuable materials across thousands of miles, with copper as one of its crown jewels. If you want to talk about revisionist economic history, start there, with the fact that North America had a sophisticated, sprawling trade economy running for millennia before any ship from the Old World ever appeared on the horizon. That is the story that got shrunk down to a paragraph, and it is far more remarkable than most of the theories built to replace it. But some people look at the arithmetic and say the finished artifacts we have found, even scattered across the whole continent, do not add up to the volume of metal that appears to have left the ground. And they ask a simple, uncomfortable question. If it was not all here, and it was not all traded south, then where did the rest of it go? Before we chase that question off the map, we have to talk about the people who never lost the thread. The Anishinaabe, the broader group that the Ojibwe belong to, carry an oral history that reaches back to a migration. The story goes that long ago, the people lived far to the east, near the great salt water, and that prophets came and warned them to move west, to follow a sacred path, until they reached the place where the food grows on the water. That food is manumin, wild rice, which grows on the shallow lakes and rivers of the western Great Lakes country. The 7 fires, they call the stages of that migration. And the end point of that long journey brought them into the exact region where the copper was. Think about what that means as an economic fact. A people arrive, over generations, in a homeland that happens to be one of the richest sources of pure, workable metal on the planet. And they knew what they had. Copper was not just useful to them, it was sacred. It carried spiritual meaning. Pieces of it were kept, honoured, passed down. It shows up in ceremony, in medicine, in the deepest layers of the culture. And the copper had a guardian. In Anishinaabe tradition there is a being associated with the deep water and with the copper of Lake Superior. Mishapeshu, sometimes described as the underwater panther, a powerful and dangerous Manitou that lived in the cold depths and watched over the metal. You did not just take copper carelessly. There were protocols. There was respect owed. The stories carry warnings about people who took too much, or took it the wrong way and paid for it. Strip away the mythic language for a moment and look at the function of that story. It is a resource management doctrine. It is a cultural rule that says this thing is precious, this thing is dangerous, and you do not strip the land bare out of greed. That is the opposite of an empire treating a colony as a quarry. And this is the crucial point that the title of this whole story hangs on. The Ojibwe knew. They knew where the copper was. They knew what it was worth. They knew, in their own framework, the rules of taking it and moving it. When later outsiders showed up acting like they had discovered virgin wilderness, full of mysterious ancient pits made by some lost race, the people already living there were standing right next to a memory that stretched back further than the pits themselves. And there is a single object that captures this whole tension better than any argument could, so let me tell you about it. Out near the Ontonagon River, on the Michigan side of the lake, there was a boulder. Not an ordinary rock, a massive piece of pure native copper, more than a ton of it, sitting where the glaciers had left it. To the Ojibwe it was not a curiosity to be sold. It was sacred, a thing of power and reverence, known and honoured for generations. They knew exactly where it was. They had known for a very long time. Outsiders heard the stories about it and became obsessed, because to a certain kind of visitor, a ton of pure copper was not a sacred stone, it was money lying in the dirt. And eventually, in the 1800s, a man hauled it out. The Ontonagon boulder was pried from its home, floated down the river, and shipped east, all the way to Washington, where it ended up in the collections of the Smithsonian. Sit with the picture for a second. The most famous single piece of copper in the whole region, a piece the Ojibwe had guarded and revered for who knows how many generations, gets loaded onto a boat and carried off to sit in a distant institution's inventory. The people who knew where it was did not get to decide where it went. Somebody else made that call, and somebody else wrote it down as a discovery. That is the whole story of the copper in miniature. The Ojibwe knew where it was. They knew what it meant. And then it got shipped somewhere else, and the official record started from the moment the outsiders showed up, as if the thousands of years before that had never happened. When people ask today where the copper of Lake Superior was shipped, they usually imagine ancient galleys crossing an ocean. But the clearest, most documented shipment we actually have is a sacred boulder going to a museum, taken from people who never stopped knowing exactly where it had been. Hold on to that, because we are about to walk into deep and contested water. For more than 150 years, there has been a fringe theory circling this region. The claim, in its boldest form, goes like this. The missing copper, the metal that supposedly left the ground but never showed up as North American artifacts, was shipped overseas, across the Atlantic, to feed the bronze industries of the ancient Old World. In this version of events, Lake Superior was not a local resource. It was a global supplier, the beating heart of an ancient international metals trade, exporting raw material to distant powers thousands of years ago. I want to be very careful and very honest here, because this is exactly the kind of claim that gets twisted. Mainstream archaeologists reject the transatlantic copper theory. They point out that indigenous North American trade networks are more than capable of explaining where the copper went, that the volume estimates on the fringe side are often inflated, and that there is no accepted physical evidence of ancient ships hauling Michigan copper to Europe. That is the scholarly consensus, and it deserves to be stated plainly. But there is a real scientific conversation underneath the noise, and it is more interesting than either side usually admits. Metal carries a chemical fingerprint. Lead isotope ratios and trace element signatures can, in some cases, be matched to a source region. Over the years, a handful of researchers have tried to argue that certain Old World bronze objects carry a signature consistent with Lake Superior copper. Other scientists have looked at the same data and said, no, the match is not clean, the method has limits, and the connection does not hold. So what you actually have is not a settled cover-up, and it is not a closed case either. You have a genuine dispute about how to read the chemistry of ancient metal, and in the space of that dispute, a much larger and stranger idea has grown up. That is where this crosses into revisionist economic history, and eventually into the thing people online now call Tartaria. Let me explain how those wires connect, because it is not obvious at first. The people who build these alternative histories start from a feeling, and the feeling is this. The official story of the ancient economy is too small. It does not feel big enough to explain what they see on the ground. They look at the scale of the ancient copper works and they think, before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases. together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. That is not a village craft, that is an industry. They look at earthworks and mounds and old canals and stone structures across the world, and they think somebody with serious organisation and serious engineering built these, and then the memory of them got flattened into vague labels like prehistoric and primitive. And they ask, who decides which economies get remembered as civilizations and which get filed away as scattered tribes? That question, by itself, is not crazy. History really is written by the people who win the argument about the past. Records really do get lost, burned, buried, and rewritten. Whole trade systems really have vanished from common memory and had to be rediscovered. The Tartaria theory takes that reasonable suspicion and runs it all the way off the edge. In the fullest version of the idea, there was once a vast, advanced, globe-spanning civilization, often called Tartaria, that had technology and infrastructure we would find surprising, and that this civilization was deliberately erased from the record within the last few centuries. Its cities, the theory says, were rebranded as older ruins or explained away. Its achievements were reassigned to other cultures, and even the physical world was reset. Some versions include the idea of a mud flood, a catastrophe that buried the ground floors of old buildings and swept the old world under a layer of silt, which is why, believers say, you see so many grand old structures with windows half sunk below street level. I am not going to stand here and tell you Tartaria was real, because the evidence for it as a literal hidden empire does not hold up. Old maps did use the word Tartary, but as a loose European label for a huge, poorly understood stretch of Asia, not as the name of a secret superstate. The mudflood claims usually dissolve when you actually learn how cities were built up and regraded over time. As history, it falls apart. But here is why it matters for our copper. The Tartaria movement is really an emotional argument about economics dressed up as an argument about buildings. At its core, it is saying, the modern story of who built the world, who mined it, who moved the goods, and who got rich is incomplete, and somebody profited from keeping it that way. And when those believers go looking for evidence of a forgotten industrial past, the ancient copper mines of Lake Superior are one of the first exhibits they reach for. Look, they say, here is proof of enormous ancient extraction. Here is metal that went somewhere the textbooks cannot fully account for. Here is your missing economy. So the copper becomes a piece of evidence in a case about the whole shape of history. Now watch what happens if you are not careful. There is an old, ugly habit in North American history of looking at ancient earthworks and mines and monuments built by native people and refusing to believe native people built them. For a long time, people invented lost white races, wandering ancient Europeans, vanished master builders, anyone at all, rather than admit that the ancestors of the indigenous nations were skilled miners, engineers, traders, and astronomers. That habit did real damage. It was used to justify pushing people off their land, because if the impressive things were built by some vanished race, then the living native nations could be treated as squatters on someone else's ruins. And this is exactly where the Ojibwe memory becomes so important and so quietly powerful, because the Ojibwe were not confused about who mined the copper. They did not need a lost civilization to explain the pits. In their understanding, the copper was theirs and their ancestors, woven into their sacred history, guarded by their own spirits, governed by their own laws of respect. The land was not a mystery to them. The mystery only exists for outsiders who arrived, saw the scale of the ancient work, could not fit it into their assumptions, and reached for stories about lost empires and secret exporters rather than asking the people who were standing right there. So when the fringe historians ask, where did all the copper go? There is a version of the answer that does not require ships crossing the Atlantic or a hidden Tartarian empire at all. The copper moved through one of the largest and longest-running indigenous trade networks in human history. It went south and east along the rivers, hand to hand, community to community, for thousands of years, feeding ceremonial life and status and craft across a continent. That is not a smaller story than a secret export empire. It might be a bigger one. It is just a story that gives the credit to the people who actually did the work. But let us not close the loop too neatly, because the honest position is that some questions really are still open. We do not have a perfect accounting of the ancient copper. Modern mining in the 18 and 1900s tore through many of the old sites before anyone was carefully measuring them, which means our baseline is damaged. The most extreme claims about billions of pounds of missing metal are almost certainly exaggerated, but the general point that ancient extraction here was on an industrial scale and that our records of it are incomplete is fair. And the scientific argument about metal fingerprints is a genuine, unfinished conversation, not a fantasy. So what do you actually do with all of this? You hold two things at once. You reject the parts that are false. There is no solid evidence of a hidden Tartarian super-civilization. There is no confirmed fleet of ancient ships carrying Michigan copper to the Mediterranean. And you flatly refuse the racist old assumption that native people could not have done their own mining, because that assumption is not just wrong, it is the poison at the root of the whole lost race genre. But you also keep the part that is real and humbling. The ancient copper economy of the Great Lakes was vast, sophisticated, and far older than most people ever learn. It was built and run by the ancestors of nations who are still here. And the official history of it is genuinely incomplete. Not because of a global conspiracy, but because colonization, industrial mining, and simple neglect wrecked the archive before anyone thought it was worth protecting. That is the revision that actually holds up, not a secret empire, a stolen spotlight. And this is where I keep coming back to the Ojibwe, because their position in this whole tangle is remarkable. Everybody else in this story needs a theory. The skeptics need trade networks to explain the metal. The fringe needs Tartaria and Atlantic crossings to explain the metal. But the Ojibwe did not need a theory, because they had a memory. They carried the knowledge of the copper forward through migration, through ceremony, through the underwater panther in the deep, through the rules about taking only what was right. While the outside world argued about whether an ancient economy could even have existed here, the descendants of the people who ran it were telling you, in their own words, that, of course, it existed, and here is what it meant, and here is how it worked, and here is why you do not strip the earth bare for greed. They knew where the copper was, and in the deepest sense, they knew where it went, because they were the ones who moved it, and they never pretended it belonged to a vanished race of strangers. Now step back and look at the shape of the whole thing, because there is a lesson buried in it that is bigger than copper. Every economy leaves two records. There is the paper record, the ledgers and the receipts and the official accounts, the thing that historians and archaeologists dig up and argue over. And there is the living record, the memory carried in a people, in their stories, their ceremonies, their laws, their sense of what the land is and what it owes and what is owed to it. When an empire wants to erase a rival, it goes after the paper first, because paper is easy to burn and easy to rewrite. But the living record is harder to kill. It hides inside language. It hides inside a story about a panther in the deep water. It hides inside a rule that says the copper is sacred and you take it with respect. The Tartaria believers are haunted by the fear that a whole world was erased and no one kept the receipts. But the irony is that in the case of the Great Lakes copper, someone did keep the receipts, not on paper. In the oral tradition of the very people that the old textbooks tried to write out of the story, the knowledge did not vanish. It was simply kept by people that the mainstream was not listening to. So maybe the real revision is not about ships or empires at all. Maybe it is about who we trust to hold the memory of an economy. For centuries, the assumption was that real history lived in European archives, and that indigenous oral tradition was just folklore, charming maybe, but not evidence. And yet here, on the shore of the coldest of the Great Lakes, the oral tradition turns out to be the most reliable narrator in the room. It never confused who did the mining. It never lost the meaning of the metal. It never needed a lost civilization to fill the gap, because for the Ojibwe there was no gap. There is one more thing worth sitting with before we let this go. Copper was, in a real sense, one of the first great commodities of the ancient world. Before oil, before gold ran the show, workable metal was the thing that changed what a society could do. It made better tools, better weapons, better trade, better status. Control the metal and you shape the balance of power. That is why the location of a metal source was never a neutral fact. It was leverage. Whoever sat closest to the purest, most abundant copper on the continent, sat on top of something other peoples wanted, would travel great distances to obtain, and would build alliances and rivalries around. In that light, the Western Great Lakes were not some remote backwater on the edge of the map. They were a center of gravity. So an ancient source of pure, abundant copper was not a curiosity. It was strategic. And the fact that one of the greatest such sources on the planet sat in the Western Great Lakes, worked for thousands of years by indigenous North Americans, should be one of the headline facts of ancient economic history. Instead, for most people, it is a blank. That blank is what the fringe rushes in to fill. And you can understand the impulse, even when the answers are wrong. When the real story is left out of the school books, people go looking for a story, any story, and sometimes they grab the wildest one on the shelf. The cure for bad revisionist history is not to mock the people asking the questions. It is to finally tell the true story loudly enough that the wild ones stop being the only ones available. And the true story is astonishing on its own. It does not need aliens or Atlanteans or a secret Tartarian empire. It needs only this: that thousands of years ago, in the cold rock of the north, people with deep skill and deeper reverence pulled a pure metal out of the earth, moved it across a continent through a trade system that lasted longer than most empires have ever dreamed of lasting, and wrapped the whole thing in a spiritual understanding that treated the copper as sacred rather than as loot, and that their descendants are still here, still carrying the memory, still able to tell you what the pits were, who dug them, and where the metal travelled. The holes in the ground under Lake Superior are not the ruins of a lost race. They are the fingerprints of a remembered one. And if you want the economic lesson underneath all of it, here it is. Value does not disappear when an empire stops writing it down. The copper had value for thousands of years before anyone in a distant capital decided to log it. It had value in the ceremonies, in the trade, in the status it carried, in the sacred weight the Ojibwe placed on it. When the modern world arrived and started keeping its own books, it did not create that value. It just seized the pen and began the story over from its own arrival. That is how a real economy gets erased. Not with a mud flood, not with a secret war between hidden empires, but with something far more ordinary and far more effective. A change in who is allowed to write the ledger, and a quiet decision about whose memory counts as history and whose counts as myth. The copper trade was not scrubbed from the record by a global conspiracy. It was demoted, filed under prehistoric, labelled primitive, left out of the school books until the only people telling the story with any drama were the ones inventing lost empires to explain it. So the next time you see one of those videos claiming that the copper of the Great Lakes was secretly shipped off to build somebody else's Bronze Age, or that it proves a hidden empire that got scrubbed from the record, remember what the honest version actually says. Yes, the ancient extraction was enormous, and yes, our formal records of it are broken and incomplete. But the missing ledger was never really missing. It was kept all along by the Ojibwe, in a language and a form that the old historians did not know how to read. They knew where the copper was, they knew what it meant, and they knew, better than anyone who came looking for a mystery, exactly where it went. The water is still cold, the pits are still there, and the story, the real one, is finally starting to be told by the people who never forgot it in the first place. Not then, and not now, not ever.